Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a deeply fascinating piece of academic research by Professor Faisal Bhabha titled Towards a Pedagogy of Diversity in Legal Education. We're going to unpack the really deep-rooted issues surrounding how lawyers are taught and the systemic challenges of diversity within the legal profession. If you're focused on understanding how the actual architects of our legal system are trained and how that training impacts society, you are in exactly the right place. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive right into this. Why is the legal profession still struggling with diversity despite decades of affirmative action? Now, you might be thinking, didn't the affirmative action initiatives and policy changes of the last few decades effectively fix the diversity problem in higher education? It's a natural assumption. But the reality, as outlined in our source material, is that the legal profession is still grappling with some absolutely profound gaps. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The legal diversity gap. 2. First-wave solutions. 3. The myth of neutral law. 4. Representation versus inclusion. And 5. The experiential learning solution. Section 1. The legal diversity gap. Now, pretty much everyone across law schools and professional associations agrees that diversity is a massive priority. There is a resounding consensus on this. Yet, as the research shows, the promise of meaningful diversity remains substantively unfulfilled. The foundation of this explainer comes from the Osgoode Law Journal. This gives us a rigorous, peer-reviewed look at institutional policies and equality gaps within legal education. The paper looks closely at demographic data to map out exactly where the legal profession currently stands versus the society actually serves. The author notes a stark divide here. Over the last few decades, rapidly changing demographics in North America have completely outpaced the entry of minority populations into law school and, subsequently, into the legal profession itself. So, as society diversified rapidly, the legal establishment simply didn't keep up at the same speed. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact scope of the problem. Looking objectively at findings from Ontario, which is a highly diverse jurisdiction, visible minorities made up 23% of the general population at the time of the study, yet they accounted for only 11.5% of the lawyers. That means minority representation in the legal profession was roughly half of their actual demographic footprint in the broader population. Half. But this abstract representation gap feels incredibly tangible when we break it down into micro data points. For example, the study highlights that there was only one Filipino lawyer for every 2,730 members of that community. Just think about the impact of that ratio on a community's access to justice and legal representation. It's staggering. The research outlines other specific community ratios as well. We're looking at one lawyer for every 627 South Asians, 1 in 750 for Black community members, and 1 in 755 for Chinese community members. The researcher points out a really concerning trend here. As older historical representation deficits begin to close, new ones form and widen, which really highlights a systemic lag. Moving to Section 2, First Wave, Partial Solutions. So what have law schools actually done to try and fix this demographic divide? Well, the first wave of diversity promotion focused heavily on targeted admissions, which we commonly know as affirmative action. It also involved altering traditional criteria, like maybe weighing LSAT scores differently, and offering curriculum reform through specialized outsider perspective courses. Now, what's really interesting about this is time and initial measures alone just aren't enough. As this quote from the source material emphasizes, additional measures may be needed to achieve further racial diversity, including changes during law school and beyond. While these first-wave methods did successfully increase numerical representation in the classroom, the research shows they fundamentally fall short. Why? Because by not addressing the underlying culture of legal education, these partial solutions often left minority students grappling with high attrition rates and pervasive feelings of professional alienation. Which brings us to Section 3, the myth of neutral law. This is the theoretical pivot of our explainer. We're now looking at the academic critique that the underlying conditions of how law is taught inherently creates exclusion, regardless of who is actually admitted to the school. So the crucial point is understanding the academic concept of perspectivelessness. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a posture in traditional legal education that treats the law as completely objective and neutral. Treating the law as a purely objective science often obscures how legal structures might perpetuate inequality, effectively muting the real, lived experiences of minorities who interact with the justice system. To understand why this matters for you as a learner, we really have to look at two distinct ideas. Traditional legal education relies heavily on formal equality. That's the idea of colorblindness and treating everyone exactly the same under a neutral law. The author argues this fails because it completely ignores systemic barriers. Substantive equality, on the other hand, acknowledges and addresses the underlying historical conditions that frustrate actual real-world opportunity. Let's move to Section 4, Representation versus Inclusion. Let's see how this builds into the broader structural comparison of diversity itself. The author carefully outlines two distinct paradigms. The first is thin diversity. This is treating diversity purely as a numbers game or a demographic metric, getting diverse bodies into the building but changing absolutely nothing about how the institution operates. The alternative is thick diversity, which requires substantive equality, transforming the core teachings, norms, and culture of the law school to be genuinely inclusive of different perspectives. It changes the whole shebang. Because without thick diversity, the academic research points out a very real danger for minority students. They're typically forced into a brutal catch-22. They either have to assimilate into a traditional, dominant, normative professional culture to succeed, or they face professional alienation. Getting a seat in the classroom is only a partial victory if the educational environment remains fundamentally inhospitable. Section 5, the Experiential Learning Solution. So how do we fix how the law is actually taught? Well, it requires moving away from traditional legal fundamentalism toward a new diversity pedagogy. Traditional doctrinal teaching focuses on the case method and abstract rules. A diversity pedagogy focuses on contextual understanding. Where the old method looks only at high-level appellate decisions, the new method focuses on the lived realities of people on the ground. And instead of a forced, neutral, objective stance, the new approach embraces pluralist narratives. This shift reduces historical barriers and creates a much more inclusive professional identity. And the vehicle to deliver this shift is experiential education. It breaks down into 3 steps. Step 1 is theory. Step 2 is practice, actually getting hands-on experience doing legal work. And step 3, which is absolutely crucial, is structured critical reflection. By enthusiastically blending hands-on experience with critical reflection, law schools don't just churn out test takers. They produce competent, practice-ready lawyers who deeply understand the human impact of the law. This ultimate pedagogical shift from mere representation to genuine inclusion is perfectly summarized by this quote from educational philosopher John Dewey, cited in the text. Give the pupils something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, learning naturally results. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider. If we successfully implement this shift in legal education, how might true inclusion and a pedagogy of diversity change the future of our justice system? If the lawyers and judges of tomorrow are trained to see the law not just as a neutral rulebook, but as a deeply human lived reality, the ripple effects on society could be absolutely profound. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.